A delivery man notices a black woman hiding an infant, but what he finds in her home causes him to call 911 immediately. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Wesley pulled into the narrow, uneven driveway of the last stop on his delivery route. The headlights of his aging sedan flickered as they bounced off the peeling paint of the small, dilapidated house in front of him. He shifted the car into park and let out a sigh, glancing at the address on his phone to confirm he was at the right place. The location matched, but something about the house didn't sit right with him. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. A porch light flickered weakly, struggling against the night's darkness. The yard was overgrown, with weeds poking through cracks in the concrete walkway leading to the door. A broken-down bicycle leaned against the rusting railing, and trash bags were piled near the steps. Wesley hesitated, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. It wasn't the first time he'd delivered to a sketchy-looking house, but this one sent an inexplicable chill down his spine. He grabbed the brown paper bag from the passenger seat, double-checking the receipt stapled to the top. Fried chicken, fries, and a soda. Simple enough. Balancing the bag in one hand, he stepped out of the car and approached the house. Each step felt heavier than the last as the silence around him thickened. Even the sounds of crickets seemed distant, as if this house existed outside the normal hum of the neighborhood. Reaching the door, Wesley knocked twice and stepped back. No answer. He leaned in closer, noticing faint scuff marks near the base of the door. Scratches, almost. He knocked again, louder this time. The sound of footsteps shuffled inside. He straightened, shifting the bag in his hands. The door cracked open just enough for him to see a pair of dark eyes staring out at him. The woman who opened the door was young, mid-20s maybe, but exhaustion made her look older. Her dark skin appeared pale under the dim porch light, and her curly hair was tied back loosely, with strands sticking to her forehead. Her eyes darted nervously behind him before settling on the food in his hands. "Delivery for Carla," Wesley said, trying to sound casual, but the unease in her expression unsettled him. "Yeah, that's me." Her voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper. As she reached for the bag, Wesley noticed her hands. Bruises, dark, fingerprint-shaped marks circled her wrists. She snatched the bag quickly, as if she didn't want him to notice, but it was too late. Wesley hesitated, his instinct to say something battling against the need to avoid prying into a stranger's life. Before he could decide, a muffled cry broke the silence. It was faint, but distinct. A baby's cry. Wesley froze. Carla flinched, her body tightening as though she expected him to react. She shifted the bag under her arm and adjusted the bundle in her other arm, drawing it closer to her chest. Until now, Wesley hadn't noticed the swaddle of blankets she carried. It moved. He glimpsed a tiny hand peeking out from the folds of fabric. A baby. Carla stepped back toward the door, her grip tightening on the child. "Thanks," she said quickly. "Good night." The door closed before Wesley could say anything else. He stood there for a moment, staring at the peeling paint and the scratched wood. The baby's cry had stopped, but the echo of it lingered in his ears. He turned and walked back to his car, but the weight in his chest only grew heavier with each step. The drive home felt longer than usual. The dark, winding streets seemed to mirror his thoughts, tangled and restless. He couldn't shake the image of Carla's bruises, or the way she clutched the baby as if expecting someone to rip it away from her. Wesley had seen his share of tough situations working deliveries, lonely elderly people, hoarders, addicts, but this was different. This wasn't just poverty or neglect. It felt like fear. Real fear. By the time he parked outside his apartment, his hands were trembling. He sat in the car, staring at the steering wheel. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He was just a delivery guy. Whatever was going on in that house was none of his business. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Carla's terrified face and the fragile bundle in her arms. He barely slept that night. Images flashed through his mind. Carla flinching, the bruises on her wrists, the baby's cry. Each time he drifted off, his dreams twisted into something darker. Shadows creeping through broken windows, a faceless man pounding on a locked door, a baby's cries echoing through empty halls. By morning, Wesley knew he couldn't ignore it. He looked up the order history on his delivery app, double-checking the address. The name listed was Carla, but no last name was provided. Payments were made in cash. There was no phone number attached to the order. He told himself he'd just check, make sure she was okay. Maybe bring an extra bag of groceries under the excuse of a customer appreciation gift. He'd done it before for regulars who were struggling. It wasn't weird. It was just kindness. Still, his stomach churned as he drove back to the house that afternoon. The daylight did little to make the place look less foreboding. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls even under the sun, and the broken window he'd noticed last night stood out even more in the light. Wesley parked a block away, unsure if he wanted to be seen returning. As he approached the front steps, he felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Something wasn't right. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked, but there was no answer. He called out Carla's name, but the house remained silent. He hesitated only for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the air was heavy, stale. The living room was sparsely furnished. An old couch, a broken coffee table, and piles of laundry scattered across the floor. Empty baby bottles sat on the counter, and dirty dishes filled the sink. Then he saw the blood. Not much, just a smear on the edge of the table, as though someone had grabbed it in desperation. "Carla," Wesley called out, his voice shaken. No answer. He stepped deeper into the house, his eyes scanning for any sign of her or the baby. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open slowly. Carla was there, sitting on the bed, holding the baby tightly against her chest. Her eyes were red from crying, and her face was streaked with tears. When she saw Wesley, she didn't scream or demand that he leave. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that broke his heart. Relief mixed with fear. Wesley didn't know what he had just stepped into, but he knew one thing: Carla and her baby needed help. And he wasn't walking away. Wesley stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Carla and the tiny baby cradled in her arms. The dim light in the bedroom cast long shadows across the bare walls, making the space feel smaller than it already was. The air was heavy, carrying a faint, sour odor that hinted at neglect and desperation. Carla's face, streaked with tears and framed by loose strands of curly hair, looked exhausted and scared. For a moment, neither of them moved. Wesley's instinct screamed at him to step back, to let her be, but the image of her bruised wrists and the smear of blood on the table outside anchored him to the spot. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Carla didn't reply right away. Her arms tightened around the baby, whose tiny face was barely visible beneath layers of mismatched blankets. The child's breathing was shallow, and Wesley's gut twisted at how frail the infant looked. She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hesitation. Then, almost as if she had decided she no longer had the strength to keep pretending, Her shoulders slumped. "Close the door," she said softly. Wesley stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt unnervingly final. He expected her to ask him to leave, to tell him that he was overstepping, but instead, Carla shifted slightly to make room on the edge of the bed. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," Wesley replied, "but I couldn't leave without knowing you were safe." That was the moment something cracked. Carla's carefully constructed walls came crumbling down, and the words began to pour out. She told him her story, haltingly at first, then faster as the emotions spilled over. She had met Eric 4 years ago. He was charming, attentive, and persistent, qualities that had swept her off her feet. But the charm didn't last. Carla described how the subtle criticisms about her looks and the clothes she wore had escalated into cruel remarks about her race. Eric would call her slurs when they argued, mocking her accent and belittling her heritage. Over time, the verbal abuse turned physical. The first slap had come during an argument about dinner. She'd overcooked the chicken, and Eric had lashed out. He apologized afterward, of course. He always apologized. But the apologies stopped after she got pregnant. When Carla told him about the baby, Eric's anger turned darker, more violent. He called the child a mistake, an embarrassment. He accused her of trying to trap him, of ruining his life. He said our son didn't deserve to exist, Carla whispered, her voice breaking. He said he'd make sure he never had to look at him. Wesley swallowed hard, struggling to keep his emotions in check as he listened. The image of Eric, cold, controlling, and filled with hatred, was already forming in his mind. Carla recounted the night she fled. Eric had come home drunk, shouting about how he was going to fix this mess once and for all. She'd locked herself in the bathroom and listened as he pounded on the door, threatening to break it down. When he finally passed out, she grabbed what little money she had, wrapped her newborn in blankets, and ran. She'd been running ever since. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Wesley asked. Carla shook her head. "Because they wouldn't protect me. Not someone like me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her experiences. Wesley didn't need her to explain further. He knew the system wasn't kind to women like Carla, women of color, women without papers, women with no resources or connections. Instead, he asked a question that had been gnawing at him since the moment he stepped into her house. "Does he know where you are?" Carla hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think so." Wesley's stomach dropped. "Why do you think that?" She reached into a drawer by the bed and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Wesley unfolded it, his heart pounding as he read the scrawled message. "You can't hide forever. I'm coming for what's mine." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "When did you get this?" "Yesterday," Carla said. "It was under the door." Wesley's thoughts raced. Eric had already found her. He was close enough to leave a note without being seen. The scratches on the door, the broken window, the shadows lurking outside, it all made sense now. "We have to get you out of here," Wesley said, rising to his feet. Carla looked up at him, panic flashing in her eyes. "Where? I have nowhere to go." "We'll figure it out," Wesley promised, "but you can't stay here." Carla didn't argue, but her fear was palpable. She moved quickly, gathering what few belongings she had, while Wesley kept watch by the door. The baby stirred and whimpered, but Carla soothed him with gentle shushing sounds. As she packed, Wesley's mind spun through possibilities. A shelter? A motel? He didn't have the answers, but he knew staying put wasn't an option. Just as they were about to leave, headlights flashed through the window. Wesley froze, his pulse quickening. "Get in the bedroom," he hissed. "Lock the door." Carla obeyed, disappearing with the baby while Wesley peered through the curtain. A black SUV idled on the street, its engine rumbling. He couldn't make out the driver, but dread coiled in his stomach. The car didn't move. Minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the SUV drove off. Wesley exhaled, but the reprieve felt temporary. Carla emerged from the bedroom, her face pale. "Was it him?" "I don't know," Wesley admitted, "but we can't wait to find out." They left the house in silence, Carla carrying the baby tightly against her chest. Wesley drove, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke, but the tension filled the car like smoke. As the city lights faded behind them, Wesley knew there was no turning back. Carla had fled her past once before. Now she was running again, but this time she wasn't running alone. Wesley drove with his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Carla sat in the back seat, clutching her baby, her eyes darting toward the rearview mirror every few seconds. The air inside the car was thick with tension, and the hum of the engine was the only sound cutting through the silence. The night stretched out ahead of them, endless and dark, as they sped away from the dilapidated house Carla had been using as a hideout. But no matter how many miles Wesley put between them and that place, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eric wasn't far behind. Carla barely spoke. She kept her baby wrapped tightly in the bundle of blankets, rocking him gently even though he was asleep. Wesley could see her trembling hands as she ran her fingers along the edge of the fabric, her breathing shallow and uneven. After what felt like an eternity, Wesley pulled into a motel parking lot on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting harsh red light onto the cracked pavement. "This isn't much," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "but it's safe for now." Carla didn't respond immediately. She glanced down at her baby, then out the window, scanning the parking lot as if expecting Eric's SUV to appear at any moment. Finally, she nodded. Wesley helped her out of the car and carried her small bag while she held the baby close. Inside, the motel clerk barely looked up from his phone as Wesley paid in cash for the room. He gave them a key and waved them off without so much as a second glance. The room was small and musty, with faded wallpaper and a sagging bed, but it was clean. Wesley locked the door behind them and double-checked the windows to make sure they were secure. Carla sank onto the bed, cradling her baby. Wesley sat in the rickety chair by the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to keep watch on the parking lot. Hours passed. Carla eventually dozed off, but Wesley stayed awake, his eyes fixed on the shadows outside. When the first rays of sunlight seeped through the blinds, Wesley's phone buzzed. He grabbed it quickly, half expecting a message from Eric, but it was just an alert from the delivery app. He exhaled, his shoulders slumping. For a brief moment, he let himself believe they'd made it through the night unnoticed. But then Carla stirred, and the look on her face shattered any illusion of safety. "He's not going to stop," she whispered. "You don't know him like I do." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Wesley knew she was right. Later that morning, Wesley left Carla and the baby in the motel room and drove into town to make some calls. He started with shelters and crisis centers, but as soon as he mentioned Carla's undocumented status, the answers were all the same. No room, no resources, no help without proper paperwork. Frustration simmered inside him as he hung up the phone and stared at his reflection in the coffee shop window. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but the complete lack of options felt suffocating. He called a friend, Marcus, who worked as a community organizer and had connections with advocacy groups. Marcus promised to reach out to his network, but even his voice carried hesitation. "This is risky, man," Marcus warned. "You're talking about crossing legal lines to help her. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Wesley didn't hesitate. "I can't leave her like this." When he returned to the motel, Carla was sitting by the window, her baby asleep in the crook of her arm. She looked up at him with the same fear and desperation he'd seen the night before. "Any luck?" "Not yet," he admitted, "but I'm not giving up." Before he could say more, a shadow crossed the window, and Carla flinched. Wesley moved quickly, peering through the blinds. The black SUV was parked across the street. Wesley's heart raced as he saw Eric step out of the vehicle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting exactly what he wanted. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open. The sudden explosion of noise jolted Carla, who instinctively clutched her baby and moved toward the corner of the room. Wesley stepped between her and Eric, his body tense. Eric's eyes burned with fury as he looked past Wesley and zeroed in on Carla. "Thought you could hide from me?" he snarled. Wesley didn't give him time to move. He lunged, shoving Eric back into the hallway. The two men grappled, slamming into the walls as they struggled for control. Eric was stronger, but Wesley fought with desperation. He could feel the sting of Eric's punches and the burn of his muscles, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. "Stay down," Wesley roared, pinning Eric against the floor. Eric's face twisted with rage. "You think this changes anything? She's mine. That baby is mine." The words sent a chill down Wesley's spine, but he didn't loosen his grip. Carla called 911, her voice shaken as she described the attack. The sound of sirens in the distance finally made Eric stop struggling. "You'll regret this," he hissed. But Wesley didn't care. The police arrived, handcuffing Eric and hauling him away. Carla gave her statement, but her fear lingered. "What if they let him go?" she asked Wesley later, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't," Wesley assured her, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He spent the next few hours talking to the officers, explaining Carla's situation and pressing them to take her claims seriously. It wasn't easy. Some of them seemed skeptical, especially when they learned about her immigration status. But one officer, a woman named Detective Ramirez, listened. She promised to file a report and connect Carla with social services. Wesley knew it was only the beginning of a long fight, but for the first time he felt like they had a chance. As they left the station, Carla held her baby close, and Wesley walked beside her. Neither of them said much, but the weight of what they'd been through hung between them. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they weren't running anymore. The station felt cold, sterile, its walls painted in shades of gray that only made the atmosphere heavier. Carla sat in the corner of the waiting area, her baby still bundled tightly in her arms. She hadn't loosened her grip since they'd arrived, and Wesley could see the exhaustion in her slouched posture. Her eyes were red, her skin pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Wesley paced nearby, his fingers tapping anxiously against his leg. The adrenaline from the fight with Eric had worn off hours ago, but the tension in his muscles refused to fade. Every time the door to the processing room opened, his body tensed, half expecting Eric to walk back out, free to finish what he'd started. But Eric was gone, at least for now. Wesley had watched as the police hauled him away, his threats still echoing in Wesley's ears. "You'll regret this." The words stuck, as sharp as any knife. Detective Ramirez emerged from the hallway, her expression calm but serious. Wesley stopped pacing and turned to her immediately. "Is he still in custody?" he asked. "For now," Ramirez replied. "We're holding him on charges of breaking and entering, assault, and making terroristic threats. But it's going to take more than that to keep him locked up long term." Wesley's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" Ramirez glanced toward Carla, lowering her voice. "She's undocumented. That complicates things." His defense could argue that she fled illegally and that this was a custody dispute rather than an abuse case. Wesley felt his hands clench into fists. "He tried to kill her. He threatened her and that baby. What more do you need?" "We need evidence," Ramirez said. "The bruises help, and so does her testimony, but the system doesn't always work the way it should, especially for people like Carla." The words hung in the air, unspoken truths that Wesley already knew. Carla wasn't just fighting Eric. She was fighting a system designed to protect people like him. "Is there anything we can do?" "I've already reached out to a lawyer who specializes in cases like this," Ramirez said. "But it's not going to be easy. She'll need character witnesses, proof of her attempts to escape abuse, and evidence of Eric's threats. And she's going to need somewhere safe to stay in the meantime." Wesley didn't hesitate. "She can stay with me." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? This could get messy. Protective orders don't always stop men like him." "I don't care," Wesley said. "She's not going back out there alone." The detective nodded slowly. "I'll file the paperwork to make sure she's listed as under protective custody. That'll buy us some time." Wesley turned to Carla, who had been listening silently. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something other than fear. Relief, gratitude, and a flicker of hope. The drive to Wesley's apartment was quiet. Carla stared out the window, her arms wrapped protectively around her baby. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the streets. Wesley couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting Eric's SUV to appear. When they arrived, Wesley helped Carla inside and showed her the small guest room he'd hastily cleared out. It wasn't much, just a bed and a dresser, but it was safe. Carla set the baby down carefully, her movements slow and deliberate, as if letting go would make everything fall apart again. "You're safe here," Wesley said softly. Carla nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. She had spent so long running, so long looking over her shoulder, that safety felt foreign, temporary. Over the next few days, Wesley worked tirelessly to put together a support network. He called Marcus, who connected them with a local nonprofit that provided legal aid to undocumented women fleeing domestic abuse. Carla met with a lawyer who began the process of filing for a U visa, a special status for victims of crime. Wesley also made sure Carla had what she needed to care for her baby: diapers, formula, clothes. He even set up a makeshift crib in the guest room. But despite the progress, Carla remained guarded. She rarely left the apartment, and she jumped at every unexpected sound. At night, Wesley could hear her pacing, soothing the baby whenever he cried. It wasn't until a week later, when Wesley came home with a bag of groceries, that something shifted. Carla was sitting at the kitchen table, feeding the baby. She looked up when he walked in, and for the first time she smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. The legal battle was grueling. Carla had to relive her trauma over and over again, telling her story to lawyers, judges, and social workers. Eric's defense tried to paint her as unstable, a manipulator who had fabricated the abuse to gain sympathy. But Carla didn't back down. Wesley stood by her side through every hearing, every deposition. He watched as she found her voice, refusing to let Eric or his lawyers intimidate her. Detective Ramirez testified about the threats and the evidence they'd collected from Carla's home. Marcus and others from the nonprofit provided statements about Carla's attempts to seek help. And Wesley told his story about the night he first saw Carla, the bruises on her wrists, the fear in her eyes, and the determination she showed in protecting her child. Months passed. The case dragged on, but little by little, Carla's life began to stabilize. She got a work permit through her U-Visa application and found a job at a local laundromat. Wesley helped her enroll in English classes, and she started attending support groups for survivors of domestic violence. Her baby, now healthier and more active, began to crawl, filling the apartment with laughter that had once been unthinkable. Wesley found himself becoming more than just a friend. He was family, a constant presence in their lives. And then, one afternoon, the call came. The judge had ruled in Carla's favor. Eric was sentenced to prison, and Carla's petition for legal status was approved. Wesley arrived home to find Carla crying, not out of fear, but out of relief. She hugged him tightly, and for the first time the weight she had been carrying seemed to lift. Months later, Wesley sat in the park watching Carla push her baby in a stroller. The boy was laughing, reaching for the bubbles floating in the air. Carla smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. Wesley had changed too. He no longer saw himself as just a delivery guy. Helping Carla had shown him a different kind of purpose, one that came from standing up when no one else would. Their journey wasn't over. Carla still had obstacles to face, and Wesley knew Eric's shadow might always linger. But they weren't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time, both of them had hope. If this story has touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Share this video with your friends and family. Maybe it will inspire someone too. Write in the comments where you're watching us from.